Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We are going to get started. Welcome to this session, Beyond the Hype, the Business of Psychedelics 2.0. My name's Imran Khan. I'm the Executive Director of the Berkeley Center for the Science of Psychedelics, and I'm going to be moderating this panel today and trying to keep our panelists in moderation too in this time of hype. If you don't know us, the Berkeley Center for the Science of Psychedelics is a research, training, and public education center at UC Berkeley dedicated to improving psychedelic education, science, and training. Why are we here for this panel? Well, unless you've been living under a rock, you'll know that this is a really exciting time in the field of psychedelics. This year, we are going to have legal use of psychedelics in Oregon, following a ballot measure there a couple of years back. Last year, the state of Colorado also voted to legalize some psychedelics. We're expecting that in the coming years, the FDA will start to approve psychedelics for therapy, for PTSD, for depression, and there's resurgence in both scientific and public interest in psychedelics around the world. This isn't just a US-based phenomenon. And if all that wasn't enough, we've now seen this year psychedelics elevated to its own track at South by, alongside energy, food, and climate change. So the question is this overhyped? Because the keen observers amongst you will also have maybe seen some of the worrying signals over the past year or so. Last year in the field of psychedelic business, we saw consolidations, we saw retrenchments, we saw fundraising getting harder, we saw investors getting more cautious. There are some major players in the field that saw their valuations tumble from the many billions down to the hundreds of billions of dollars. And just in the last few weeks, we saw a major provider of psychedelic facilitation training and clinics, Synthesis Institute in Oregon, hit some tough times and declared bankruptcy. Some might call this a bubble bursting. Palo Santo's very own Tim Schlick called it an overdue market correction. So we'll see which of those sides we veer to in this panel. In a second, I'm going to introduce our panelists to introduce themselves, and I'm going to come to you as the audience as well to hear who's here. But I'm going to start off by asking each of our panelists to have a maximum 1 minute. Who are you? What do you do? And what's been your favorite thing at South by so far this year? Daniel.
Am I on here? Am I good? Click it off. Just don't take away from my minute. I feel like a senator. I want 15 seconds back on the clock there for the thing. I think the minute was directed at me.
You're wasting more time now, Daniel.
Right. I'm Daniel Goldberg, co-founder of Palo Santo. We're a venture capital fund focused pretty much entirely on psychedelic therapeutics. What was the question?
Who are you?
Yes.
What do you do?
Yes.
What's been your favorite thing at South by?
Favorite thing, it really has been being able to, it sounds a little cheesy, but see so many incredible people in this business and people tangentially involved in this business. It's an incredible community. The business is filled with really a lot of people that lead from the heart. Maybe a couple sociopaths out there that are trying to get into the space that we need to watch, but really an amazing group of people by and large. And I make that, obviously I'm joking around about sociopaths, but there's a lot of different types of people getting in psychedelics, but it's an incredible group of people by and large, and there's a reason why we got into the space. Yeah.
And what do you do?
What's that?
What do you do?
I'm venture capital fund focused on we invest in psychedelic businesses. We invest. We'll get into that, but we invest in all throughout the entire psychedelic ecosystem, funding businesses that we believe have the best chance of making the most impact.
Thank you, Myriam.
Yeah, this is working, right? All right. So hi everyone, my name is Myriam. I'm the co-founder and COO of Journey Clinical. And what we're doing, I have my husband also in the room who's my co-founder. And what we're doing at Journey Clinical is really addressing the mental health crisis. We are expanding access to psychedelic therapies, and we're building the infrastructure solution to empower licensed mental health professionals to offer this treatment in their own practice. We believe that this is the way that we can provide a very high level of care for people suffering from anxiety and depression. And I will echo Dan. I think the best reason to be here is to see all of you. We spend most days behind our computers doing really complex things, and so here connecting with people is really the nicest thing. And visiting Austin for the first time too is beautiful.
And Luke?
I'm Luke Postiavsky, and I'm the co-founder and chief operating officer of Tactogen, Inc. And Tactogen is a biopharmaceutical company focused on small molecule drug discovery and drug development, specifically for intactogens. And intactogens is a term that was coined by Dave Nichols, who was here yesterday, and also his son, Chuck Nichols, was here. It's a term that means connecting within. And these are non-psychedelic molecules that essentially increase our feelings of self-acceptance and temporarily reduce our neuroticism and lower our self-defenses and help us connect more with ourselves and with other people. And so we're focused on novel intactogens that engineer out the off-target effects of MDMA, so some of the cardiac and blood pressure issues and the lowered mood or lessened optimism that people frequently experience the next day or 2 days later. And my favorite thing about South by Southwest is the people. I think that there's a tremendous cauldron of creativity and idealism, and also people that sort of marry that with a lot of pragmatism and do stuff in the world. And so that's, my cup is filling up with inspiration. Great to be with you all.
Thank you. One of the reasons I was really excited to chair this panel is because, like any industry, psychedelic business is really diverse. Just on this panel, you've heard from investors, you've heard from a B2B infrastructure company that's trying to underpin the rollout of mental health services, and you've got Luke who's running drug discovery in his company. And what that illustrates is that under this label of psychedelic business, you have that really broad value chain. You've got everything from the early stage work, capital intensive work, to discover some of these novel psychedelics and bring the ones that we already know about to market. And you've got all the way through to manufacturing. You've got people who are training facilitators. You've got people who are running and operating clinics. You've got people who are setting up retreat centers in different parts of the world. And maybe we'll go into some of the kind of elements of what that diversity looks like in practice. But I wanted to kick off by asking Luke and Myriam in particular to tell us about when you kind of started doing what you were doing. How did you look at this emerging world of psychedelic business and figure out the role that you could play, and what does the ecosystem look like from your vantage point? Luke, can I start with you?
Sure. It was early 2020, and COVID was, the shelter in place was just announced. And I was in an interesting place where I was contemplating, I wanted to do something in the psychedelic science field. And on the first week of shelter in place, I actually wrote a list of, have you heard of Dunbar's number? The number of sort of stable social relationships you can have with people at the same time. So I actually wrote out a list of 140 people in the field that were doing really interesting things. And these were academics, and they were researchers and activists and venture capitalists and bankers and across the field. And I started I had this initial thesis that I was workshopping in the style that we do there's a Stanford class that I've been a mentor to for 8 years called Entrepreneurship in Environmental and Civil Engineering, and it's a bunch of PhD research students, and they basically test out an idea, and put together a business plan over a 12-week course. And I was sort of testing out this idea: could you have a different kind of investment bank that was a public benefit corporation with different kind of remuneration models around it, so not just focused on consummating a deal, but some kind of, was the deal good, right? Like a merger or a capital raising or whatever. And so I was testing out this kind of idea for the psychedelic and neuroscience innovation area, and that was like my excuse to talk to a bunch of really interesting people, and also as an extreme extrovert, locked into, a 3-bedroom house by myself in Sonoma County during COVID, I needed to, talk to people. And so I was scheduling, these 140 kind of informational interviews, and I did this over a period of time. And then I was introduced to Matthew Baggett, who many of you in the room will be familiar with, but he's a neuroscientist and a machine learning expert, and was the one that wrote the original investigators brochure for MAPS for MDMA, and really one of the seminal researchers in the MDMA field. And he had specific ideas around how you could create something that was gentler and had a favorable safety profile that could be used more flexibly and in more settings potentially outside of the clinic. And so in this kind of meandering, survey of what's going on in the field, I stumbled upon someone that I thought had a really differentiated thesis married to a background that it seemed like, okay, there's the stuff to really enact this. And so that's a kind of a longish answer on that, but that's the way it happened. And then we did essentially 3 months of what I would term as founder deep dating, which I highly recommend if you're thinking about founding something with, doing like a transformational, generational sort of project where, because it is effectively a kind of marriage. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for 90-minute sessions, we talked about everything under the sun related to the project and, do we have the kind of complementary skill sets and the sort of long-term orientation and all of these things. And that was very beneficial because it created a sort of foundation, sort of like pre-marriage counseling, but it was great. And then we decided, we're doing this, and we're going to do this, with vigor and with passion and do it. So that was how it happened.
And Myriam, you did some founder dating as well, right?
Yeah, I can talk about the marriage piece.
Yes.
We're married, so it looks like we all had similar stories. During COVID, at the time we were engaged, we're not married yet, we were looking at the psychedelic ecosystem and trying to kind of wrap our head around, what existed and what were the opportunities. And what we saw was a lot of capital already flowing into drug dev, so a lot of clinical trials, and then B2C offering that were targeting patients. And the problem we were trying to solve was really this idea of there's about 1 million therapists out there, and those people are not offering psychedelic assisted therapy, and we have ketamine, which is FDA approved and has been for many, many years and is legal. And so the problem, we went down the rabbit hole of that problem statement to try to understand why our therapists who went to school for a really long time, have master's degrees, or have a board that they report to, why are those people not offering psychedelic therapy when we have this perfectly legal evidence-backed ketamine that we can start with today? And so that led us to understand that actually forming and maintaining relationship, if you're a therapist, so like an LCSW, LMHC, forming and maintaining a relationship with a prescriber, whether it's an MD or a psychiatric nurse practitioner, is really difficult. And so we started off by really taking on the medical aspect of the treatment, and this is how we developed our approach to care, which is a collaborative care model. On the one hand, and you can think about this as a triangle, on the one hand you have Journey Clinical, where we take on the medical part of the treatment. That means we do eligibility, we do prescription, and we do outcome monitoring. On the other side, you have the therapist that takes on the care, the day-to-day care for the patient. And there's this collaboration that happens, really deep collaboration between the medical team and the therapist to support the patient and to really support enhanced clinical outcomes. And this is how we started with Journey Clinical, building this collaborative care. And we had a small group of therapists, and we built really close relationship with them to understand what are their other needs, like what else do they need in order to grow their practice with this treatment. And we started understanding that they really needed community. Oftentimes there are people that are solo practitioners that have been stuck, like all of us, during COVID in their home. So we started building the community. Then we understood that these people also needed education. We partnered up with Fluence to offer some training. And then they also needed professional resources in order to grow their practice. So it started off from this medical organization growing into this membership program for therapists, and today we're really happy that we have 700 therapists on our platform who are actively offering ketamine-assisted psychotherapy to their patients and using ketamine as an adjunct for patients to really feel better.
That's an amazing story. Thanks, Myriam. Daniel, before I come to you, I also just wanted to get a quick temperature check in the room. I'm going to ask the audience kind of just what brings you here, and none of these answers are mutually exclusive, so feel free to put your hand up more than once. But who's here because you currently work in the psychedelic field? Okay, decent chunk. Who's here because you want to learn more about the sector? Almost everyone, great. Who wants to work specifically in a psychedelic business or start a psychedelic business? Okay. Who's here to invest? Great. And who's just curious? Lovely. Okay, this is great. So Daniel, that's kind of where the audience is, and we've provocatively called the session Beyond the Hype. What was the hype? How did we get there? And what was Psychedelic Business 1.0?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I just want to say if you've raised your hand because you're an investor, you've been targeted, and you will. No, we're done raising our fund, which is quite liberating. It's quite liberating to be on a panel when you're done fundraising. I don't want to think like a politician where everything changes the next day. I don't think it does, but it is. There's something to be said there. Beyond the hype. I think it was a year ago at South by. We did a panel. We did our. They had their first kind of psychedelic panels. It wasn't really a track, and maybe 24 hours before that panel, I think I took my notes and I just had to tear them up because that's about when the hype cycle started to end. There were companies just starting to fold just the day before that were quite hyped up and had all kinds of interesting PR releases. And that was really the beginning of a very different era. I would describe the hype as the reason. It's not necessarily not necessarily from bad intentions. I would say the promise of psychedelics is more exciting than ever, and the cultural movement is more exciting than ever, and destigmatizing and sharing our stories, and the development of new medicines like Tactogen and care delivery like Journey Clinical. That there's nothing more exciting. We've never been more excited about that. I think it comes down to valuations. I think it comes down to really just that maybe it's similar to Internet 1.0 and Internet 2.0, and we're gonna, we have yet to see our Amazon. I was gonna say, I said this to you last night, maybe it's MySpace to Facebook. I don't think you can say that anymore because Facebook is so evil, but you get the idea. Considered so evil nowadays, but the hype really is something that it really comes down to valuations and some very interesting macro economic conditions that changed. There was a very serious biotech markets crash that has not recovered the same. It didn't have the same kind of recovery as the Dow or the S&P, and that has a huge impact. So the risk of future financing now for companies that are largely biotech really is a major factor. So the idea that you could make a broad bet into psychedelics or buy stocks because they went down from 10 to 8 to 4, they can be a zero. And many of them will be a zero. And I think during a hype cycle, it never feels that way. So I'd say about a year ago, we started seeing this shift. We happen to be lucky in that the scale of our fund and the kind of diversification that we had has allowed us to navigate that, hopefully successfully. We're trying to be humble about our next moves, and we have a lot reserved for follow-ons, but it's very challenging times for companies to raise capital. That's really I would say the biggest change in what we're seeing now is recognizing that this is a biotech business where we need life science investors to come on in and support these early psychedelic investors that we all work together. I saw Lindsay and Simeon come in from JLS, another fund that we work with. We co-invested in Fluence, actually. You mentioned Fluence. So we have to work together to support and fund this ecosystem until the life sciences funds and some of the biotech investors recognize the potential as well, which they're starting to do, but it takes time.
Was it a tricky decision for you to choose to be a psychedelic-only fund?
Was it what?
Was it a tricky decision for you to choose to be a psychedelic?
Yeah, at the time, yeah. You talk about dating. I didn't think we were going to talk about founder deep dating. This is really awkward. I mean, I just took some notes here. I did some founder deep dating too. My co-founder Tim Schlitt, who's here in the front row. Yeah, I'd call it deep dating. I mean, I wasn't expecting to go to my first Burning Man for 3 nights. That was not in the plans. Yeah, it was a very challenging, a very difficult decision. It was very exciting. I live in Chicago. Tim's in New York. I would say Chicago is a bit of a desert in terms of the psychedelic community. Growing now, everything changes every few months as people do share their stories, this becomes more destigmatized. But it was a very challenging decision, and it was really when COVID hit. It was really lockdown. I mean, Tim and I had been friends for 3 years, and there was some deep dating. I'm not going beyond. I'm not telling any more deep dating stories with Tim. I'm not. This is all being filmed, okay? And my wife is sitting right next to him, so that's where that ends. But it was a difficult decision, but it was an exciting decision, and it was made in a way a bit easier when COVID hit. There was a bit of like, what do you have to lose, right? That now people are talking about mental health in a very different way. I would get calls. I have 4 boys, 3 of them teenagers, 2 of them not teenagers anymore, and then a little guy. And the calls we would get where people opened up about their struggles with mental health, it just changed everything. I lost one of my best childhood friends who it was not maybe the biggest shock in the world. He drank himself to death. There was probably, I think he was prescribed a bottle of Xanax or SSRIs by someone who doesn't even know what they're doing. He drinks a lot. Suicide, maybe not a suicide. That was 3 months into COVID. It wasn't as hard as those stories came in, and we had built up this thesis, not knowing exactly that it would be a VC fund. We sort of originally pictured it as maybe finding a few companies to back, and then quickly realized that you need that diversification. You don't know who's going to be a winner, who's going to be a loser. Sorry, did I go way over?
No, that's
All
great.
right,
It actually brings me on to the next question
All
I was going to ask Myriam, which is that, we use the word hype as kind of a pejorative term, that it's a negative, but for me it also reflects hope, excitement, this kind of belief in kind of psychedelic redemption, all the good news stories we get out of psychedelics. So surely there are some good things behind the hype, and if so, what's wrong with hype? Why do we need to be having this panel saying beyond the hype?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the hype, there's the high, there's the lows, and then there's the reality. There's what actually happens when all the dust settles. And what we saw at Journey Clinical, and I think this ties back to what you were saying, there was a lot of money flowing towards drug dev, towards we're going to create new molecule, new clinical trials, etc. But there was really not much going on in terms of the mental health crisis. People needed relief today. It was during COVID, we were in our living room, and people needed relief today, not in 3 years, not in 5 years, not when MDMA assisted therapy is going to be approved, today. And so for us, that was a big question of let's be practical and tangible and think through what can we create today to help create some relief. And I think in addition to that, there is the promise of psychedelics, of the 1,000 clinical trials, and really this question of, can we build an infrastructure that is going to be sustainable, as in when we receive more FDA-approved compounds, we will be able to actually get them to the people who need them. And so for us, that was the big question that we wanted to answer, was let's make sure we can have an infrastructure that as we receive new FDA approval, hopefully, soon, hopefully MDMA soon, and then psilocybin, these treatments are ready to go. They're ready to be used by the people who need them the most. And I think to this point of practicality and really people doing real work in their communities was the question of, we need to build a sustainable and a healthy business to support that. And it means we need to make decisions grounded in reality. And as a founder, you're in the business of making rapid decisions. And so that was the big question of, how do we make rapid decisions that really support sustainability and that over time will benefit everybody in the ecosystem?
I love that distinction between the excitement of what might be to come in years down the road and the excitement of what's possible now, and neither of those are necessarily good or bad, but knowing the difference is kind of the key to how you operate.
I was just going to add, it's funny, it sounds very unhyped right now. Everybody's very sober-minded, right, the next day. By the way, we were at an event last night, and not completely sober, so maybe a little tired. That could be part of it. But the hype really, to give credit where this started, and I know that most of you know this story, but who Imran works with, your partner, your boss, I don't know, manager, I don't know how we call it, but Michael Pollan, of course, being an integral part of starting the Berkeley Center for Psychedelic Science Psychedelics. I got to work on that. But when that book came out, of course, it changed everything, and it was a huge moment. It brought myself in almost 5 years ago. And there was nothing wrong, I don't think, with the hype at that time. Of course, there's always backlash, right? He takes a lot of heat for like, oh, this, and he didn't say that, or didn't cover MDMA enough, whatever. But that was incredibly important to have this, to start the conversation in a very different way. And I don't think any of us knew. No one knew. He didn't know. Asked him, I was like, how the hell, it was going to get that hyped up. And I do think it took a real moment like that to get everyone to recognize how real this is. And then I think you have to take a bit of a sober-minded view years later. I know Tim and I had this period of our personal work with psychedelics, and we're very happy that we didn't start the business at that time. Yeah. We would have been proselytizers and not a business, people. So.
Yeah. And Luke, I want to come back to you. And again, we've talked about this, the fact that there have been these huge drops in valuations, there have been bankruptcies, there have been consolidations, and some people might see these as signals of bad times or hard times. Are there potential signs of a sector maturing and growing up? What's your take on that?
Yeah, so even the word hype, right? Like you're thinking, what constitutes extravagant attention on something? Excessive attention on something. And when most people that come to this field come to it through their own personal healing experiences. And they experience, they are able to look at dark and unconscious material and surface it and bring it into the light and move through it and heal it. And we all have that. And there's a lot of it. And when we go through these kind of personal healing experiences, whether it's with medicines that have been used in indigenous communities for a long time, like ayahuasca or iboga or psilocybin, or whether it's MDMA or 2CB or these experiences that are generally more reliably positive experiences that are just, heart-opening kinds of experiences. We move stuff. And we often come to the personal conclusion that there's nothing more important than our own personal and familial and collective healing. And so is that excessive? Is that extravagant? Or is it just obvious, right? And so there, I would like to separate these kind of conversations of, day traders that are, trading, stocks on, looking at subreddits on shroom stocks and doing positions versus what we all know at some deeper level is underway, right? And even, one of the things, since we kind of waxed personal on motivations, I feel okay sharing this too. Early COVID, there were these fires in Northern California. And we, the one sort of thing that in addition to the Zoom calls, I would take these walks on this trail and then, big fires happened. And so Sonoma County was just, the air quality was terrible. And it was rough. And I had friends whose place, they had 15 minutes to evacuate. Their place was burned to the ground, and there was a lot of climate grief. And it's not recognized as an official thing in the DSM, but it's showing up clinically all the time. It's showing up with adolescents and young people. It's showing up. I was talking to an investigator-initiated trial person at MAPS that mentioned a researcher in Australia that has experienced tremendous climate grief in this local population. And, and sometimes it takes a while for something to come into the DSM. It certainly did with PTSD. It certainly did. Prolonged grief just became a thing. Well, People that have experienced prolonged grief knew it was a thing. And so one question, are psychedelics and the psychedelic experience and entactogens, which allow people to entertain difficult emotional truths that they would normally lock in the closet, are there unique properties where these substances within a community of supportive practices, not alone, help us navigate these difficult existential things, the sixth extinction? Can we look at something that is so profoundly difficult that we want to put away in a new light that will allow us to move through it and hopefully take some corrective action that will actually make a difference to our collective civilizational well-being? And so I on the hype question, I don't think that understanding ourselves or our consciousness or our ability to cooperate with one another and be loving to one another and be kind to one another, I don't think that that's underrated at all. I think that the financial markets are whatever they are, right?
I'd love to delve into this a bit more because, I think we've all seen that a lot of people come to psychedelic business, but psychedelic work more generally, because they've had immensely powerful personal, perhaps transcendent experiences, and that gives me a huge passion for this work. And a passion that turns into kind of, belief and faith and kind of just a huge amount of energy for the work they're doing. But ultimately, the work you're doing is all business as well. And Myriam, I'd love to hear you reflect on, does that kind of special nature of the psychedelic experience change psychedelic businesses into something other than a normal business? Or at the end of the day, are you just doing business?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. When I was listening to you speak, I really think there's an opportunity for connection. And I think both from a business and a healing standpoint, I think this is the opportunity that we can create. I think what we can create is doing well by doing good, is creating virtuous cycles where healing is aligned with business outcomes. And I think as an industry, we can really come together and connect and kind of connect those dots. So for example, at Journey Clinical, what we see is that when we do well, the company, Journey Clinical, does well. That means our investors, our shareholders are doing well. It also means that the therapists, who are independent practitioners, have healthy businesses. And that means that they're supporting their patients to have better clinical outcomes. And so I think this new paradigm that we're in is really about how do we align clinical outcomes to business outcomes. And they don't need to be in opposition to each other. I think there is a real opportunity for connection as we build this thriving industry and really deliver on the promise of psychedelic therapy.
And I'm sure there's some who would say that, the kind of almost capitalism in business feels like an anathema to psychedelics. The idea that the things that psychedelics make us think about are connection to nature, kind of interpersonal connections, certainly not kind of dollars and cents. How would you respond to someone who says, well, why do we need to kind of be focusing on creating huge kind of global business to do this in the first place? Why can't we go back to basics?
Well, I think, in our case, we're a health tech business. That means we're operating within a system, whether it's broken or not, is beyond us. But we have a system. This system has constraint. This system has opportunities. I think what we can do collectively is find those opportunities, is tap into those opportunities, and find them and shape them and grow from there. And I think that is the real opportunity here.
Yeah, that taps into something we were talking about regulation, that, there's regulation changing on a state level and there's regulation changing on a federal level, and both of those are creating opportunities and challenges, and it's shaping the excitement that people are seeing. How does that factor what you do as an investor?
Yeah, and just to zoom out for a minute, because sometimes there is confusion between just the what I would call the broad psychedelic movement, which I would sort of put in two different categories. That there's a little bit of an overlap. It's like a Venn diagram where you have the legalization kind of the state by state, decrim legalization, the Oregon model, which is well beyond decrim, right? They're trying to be a new medical model, but it's not federally legal, and there's all kinds of issues going on there. I'm largely supportive of it. I slowed down there. Do you notice? Largely supportive of it, but I think there are some real issues, and it's not going to serve the most amount. I don't think it's going to serve the greatest amount of people. I think there are going to be some real issues with rolling it out. But that is one thing, and then you have this, what I would say, fully legal on a federal, state, local level, however you want to think about it. We're no different than any other biotech business or healthcare delivery business. The drug you're working with is completely legal right now, an FDA-approved medicine. It's just an off-label use, right, generally. So you have, just to zoom out for a minute, you have these two models. We're all in pretty much one side of the model, but supportive of the other because, quite frankly, it's going to serve different people with different needs, and it's happening now, and it also relates to drug policy reform and social justice. So that's one thing. Say the question real quick. I'm going to give you another 20 seconds.
Say that again.
Give me the question real quick, and I had something else.
I mean, you really touched upon it, saying that you're active in the federal space.
Yeah, right.
And that's where you're investing in terms of the companies that are looking.
Yeah,
at
but in terms of scale, I don't think they have to be large global businesses. I think they can be all different sizes, and I don't differentiate so much between. I don't think for-profits I don't think nonprofits are necessarily more virtuous than for-profits. I think there's incredible people doing incredible things in for-profit companies that aren't going to be diverted into some big evil corporation. I think they're going to be nonprofits that there's some unintended consequences. So I think there's going to be a lot of different ways to address this. We are working within the Western medical model. I think it's evolution versus kind of revolution in a way. I have a kid who's a very left of Bernie Sanders and wants to blow up oil pipelines and unionize Starbucks, and he'll probably just take over our businesses and unionize our businesses. So I probably should stop him. But that's a different way of thinking of things. But I think we have to work with what we have right now. We have to address people's problems today. If we can largely replace, potentially, not replace, but have a different option for SSRIs in a couple years, that could be very helpful while we make greater change. I'd love to get rid of the DSM at some point. Why not?
I mean, Luke, you touched upon this. Daniel's sitting here as an institutional investor, but you brought up shroom stocks, and there is kind of huge consumer investment going on as well. We've seen some variation in how that's gone. Do you think there's a future there for kind of consumers to invest in publicly listed psychedelic companies, and what do you think about that as a company that may one day aspire to that?
Sure. I would say that when you're thinking about new ventures generally, it's this kind of magic combination of good ideas and capital availability and people that are obstinate enough to just keep going no matter what, right? So and that have the sort of requisite skill sets to do those things. And if you have this beautiful marriage of those three things, then you've got something that's really potentially very good, right? Regardless of what the cycles are in, regardless of whether SVB goes into receivership or there's a run on the bank at First Republic, or whether no matter what happens, right? Steady as she goes. You got good ideas, good people, and capital, then you can do good stuff. And when I look at the space, I think about companies that have very differentiated ideas and a lot of scientific heft. A good example would be our good friends at Psychedelics Therapeutics. I think that what Gilgamesh is doing is very, very interesting. It's potentially very differentiated. I saw yesterday our friends from 2A Biosciences working on inflammation. I think that what they're doing is really interesting. We got Cacti Therapeutics here, so these are good people with good ideas that generally have access to capital. Maybe it has been a difficult environment overall over the last 12, 18 months. I would also just say we benefited hugely with early supporters, early investors that allowed us to start filing on our novel ideas in gentler entheogens before a lot of the other players came into the fold. And so investors that are sort of open about having invested in entheogen, like our friends at Palo Santo that put together this panel, and like a few others, were hugely influential because we were able to synthesize molecules, build out our machine learning platform, do the in vitro and in vivo and in silico sort of assays, file a bunch of intellectual property in the chemical space around MDMA, and refine that sort of innovation process. And then a lot of other players started looking at this, and they were, previously focused mainly on psychedelics, that are ego-dissolving sorts of substances and not sort of gentler entheogens. And so we were focused on this: what is a potential first-line treatment before somebody would be prescribed SSRIs? Like let's say somebody had, for instance, adjustment disorder, and they were going through a divorce or a death in the family or job loss or something like that. Well, most of those people don't need to go on SSRIs necessarily, right? And most of it resolves within 80% of adjustment disorder resolves within 12 months. But if you had a medicine where you felt deep self-love and self-acceptance and could look at some difficult material and unearth it and then accept it, maybe you wouldn't need to develop a lifelong dependency on an SSRI, for instance. And so I would just say that thankful for early supporters because they play a very critical part of the ecosystem, and also, good ideas and people that are really focused on a differentiated thing are decorrelated from the economic cycle. And so, hype or no hype, just focus on that and get off of the shroom stock subreddit.
Just so Luke isn't accused of starting a rumor, as far as we know, there is no run on First Republic Bank right now. I'm going to come to the audience in a few minutes for questions. So if you have something burning in your mind that you'd like to ask our panelists, get it ready. But a couple of quick questions for each of you before we go to the next stage. One is, I'm curious if there's kind of interesting trend or challenge that you see from your vantage point in psychedelic business that may be non-obvious to other people in the room. And the second is if you've got any advice to someone currently trying to get into the business of psychedelics who might be in this room. So I'm going to go down the panel one question at a time. So Daniel, starting with you. Interesting trend, interesting challenge that you can see that others might not?
Well, the obvious answer is still access to capital. But I think to dig a little deeper there isn't, in my opinion, always a rhyme or reason as to why certain companies get funded. It can be, there's a variety. I'm just laughing because I think about some of the companies that did get funding, and it's pretty wild, and others that aren't. There's a lot of great companies out there that aren't getting the funding, that maybe don't have the most interesting, sexy story to tell, from a media perspective, right? Even, for example, you even like an entheogen isn't, you have to explain to someone, right, what an entheogen is, because all the stories out there are based on, these larger macrodosing of really ego-dissolving, primarily like 2A agonists like tryptamine, molecules. So that can be a challenge, just in terms of storytelling. And I think focusing on founders too, right? Like a year and a half ago, there was a bit of what I would call like a sort of a cult of personality aspect to founders, right? It was just a lot of storytelling, but there wasn't always something behind that story. So I think execution-oriented founders some with a lot of experience in the field, but others with experience that can translate into this new field, and also founders that are willing to realize that you can take a company from point A to point B with this team, but when that next round comes in, you need different skill sets. That's something that wasn't being looked at a year and a half ago, right? Today, we're back to like writing checks and saying, what does that team look like? I mean, and it can range. There's all different types. You need that heart-centered, you need people that really understand how these molecules work. My first experience, by the way, in psychedelics was at age 45 with MDMA. I had this bias towards